All right, shall I start then?
Sure.
Yep. Okay. So, so welcome everyone. So today we're going to be talking about Cynefin framework, which is a sense-making framework that was developed by Dave Snowden. It's going to be 21 years this year that it's been developed, and we're going to talk about what it is. We're going to first be doing an introduction on what types of systems exist in the world. We're going to have a conversation about complex adaptive systems. We're going to be talking about the issue or the idea of affordance. Then we will be doing an introduction to Cynefin framework. I'm going to tell you my thoughts on what I believe is the tyranny of expertise within cybersecurity. We're going to then be talking about some heuristics on how to manage in complexity. And then the interesting part that even those of you who may be familiar with the Cynefin framework itself, you may not be aware of the domain models. So we're going to be talking specifically about the four domain models, one for each domain, which tells us the types of situations we are likely to encounter when dealing with in each of the different four domains of Cynefin. And then we're going to be finishing with a view on how we can use ideas from Cynefin in complexity science to help us develop security strategy. And that is about scaffolding, talking about constraints, about exit strategies from aware, which is kind of the old disorder domain of Cynefin. And we're going to be talking about some analogies on how we can use those analogies to help inform our strategies. And then we'll be finishing. So this is going to be a double act between myself and Phil Huggins. So to begin with, so complex adaptive systems theory is the basis of the Cynefin framework. In nature, what we have three types of systems. Right? We have order systems. So these are systems that have a high level of constraints. So we'll be having a section just on constraints, but for now it's enough to understand that a constraint is either something that contains, which is the typical way we think of constraints, but it's also something that connects, right? So it can be both. An ordered system is something that is predictable. So we know what's going to happen, and there's a clear relationship between cause and effect. And because it's ordered, it's very attractive for us humans. And we often take it to excess because it's so attractive to us. But the cost of achieving this order is massive. So think of all the things that we put on checklists in security and how well that's going for us, right? So do people actually pay attention? The heuristic here is that when we over-constrain a system that is not naturally constrainable, we get breakdown, right? And that's a lot of what happens with us in cybersecurity, I think. So think of expense systems, for instance, or even our compliance checklists. What ends up happening is people will find ways around the system or ignore as much as they can. They game the system. That's what ends up happening when we over-constrain something that is not naturally constrainable. Then we have chaotic systems. So a chaotic system is where we have no effective constraints, right? So it's not contained, nothing seems to be connected, everything is a mess, right? The key management action when we are in dealing with a chaotic system is to introduce constraints, right? So that's the main thing that we can do on it. And this is where crisis management, for instance, comes in. So in a chaotic system, we don't look to find solutions. What we want to do is add some constraints so we can create some type of structure, but knowing that the introduction of these constraints will create a new type of system. So as soon as we try and put constraints, we change the system itself. And that's going to become important a bit later. But if we get there on purpose, that's where we can find radical innovation. So companies that are very good at doing radical innovation, they go on to chaotic, they remove all constraints and they see the things that emerge. And then there are also complex adaptive systems. So generally, these are constraints. They generally not containers, and when all is connected with everything else. But the nature of these connections may be different, right? So the situation itself is unforeseeable because we don't have linear relationships between cause and effect. So in this type of system, the system is dispositional, not causal. Right. So what I mean by this is that the system will have a tendency to act or behave in a certain way. So when we do interventions, we can't be certain of its outcomes, or we can't clearly associate, I've done this, so I got that, right? So that's not how a complex adaptive system works. So we can't predict it. But if we do have real-time access to data from it, so if we've got effective feedback loops, I can control things which cause effects on it. So in complexity, we call them modulators. So I know that I do things and things happen to the system itself. And then through those feedback loops, if I've got them quick enough, I can control what happens to it and how the system behaves. Right? So cybersecurity itself is a complex adaptive system. Organizations are complex adaptive systems. And what we tend to forget is that security, as safety, is an emergent property of a system and not a thing that we do or we implement or we buy technology for. That may be what we call it, but that's not what it is. Okay, so when we're making changes to our organizations, we are co-evolving its security property, as is every other change that happens in your organization. So the idea of governance changes, of process changes, of all those other things, they change how our organizations behave. Right? And these are the three types of systems in nature. Phil?
Sure. So complex adaptive systems, I think Mario's done a fantastic intro there. One of the characteristics of a complex adaptive system that you can look for, and not all of them have this, but this is not uncommon, is large numbers of interactions. So the connecting constraints that Mario was talking about. He's already identified, within an organization, you might see change controls, you might see different activities. But if you think about the cybersecurity domain, the thing that we think about, you've got defenders, you've got the blue teams, you've got your attackers, and traditionally that's where we limit our models. How good are the attackers? How good are the defenders? Do we think we're going to get successfully attacked? But you've also got your developers, you've also got your executives, you've also got legal authority, police forces, lawyers, regulators, politicians, users, suppliers, infrastructure providers. There is a large number of actors consistently interacting, especially when we're connected to the internet, and all operating with different requirements, different goals, and different capabilities. And if you could predict one of them, you'd be doing fantastically. To be able to predict the results of all of them is difficult. Another interesting thing with complex adaptive systems is they don't always appear complex. So you will sometimes find islands of stability forming. The general system will dance around what we call a dancing landscape, but you'll find these the peaks and the valleys that seem to hang around for a while, and we have those in cyber as well. So I think when you look at low adaptive attackers, people who don't have a lot of energy, and that might be the ransomware guys, they've got a tool, they'll use it to attack 100,000 firms. If one of those firms has got good controls, they don't care. They're not going to come back. They're not going to adapt their action to the environment because they've still got 99,000 firms to go and look at. That would imply, those ransomware guys don't change their tactics very often. It looks like a fairly stable threat to think about. And over the short term and possibly the medium term, that's true. But I would say, tell me what you were thinking about ransomware 10 years ago. Over the long term, it's you wouldn't have predicted we are where we are today. As we shift through the attackers, you end up with these more opportunistic guys who, or ladies, who find weaknesses that we've allowed to occur in our environments and exploit them and see what they can get. They're not after anything particular, probably money or data. They're not coming at us in a particular way. They're just taking advantage of the opportunity. And they're, something we can think about and reason about because in theory, we understand our environments. And we can make some predictions about where their interests and our failures intersect. When it becomes much more difficult is when we're dealing with a group of attackers who are focused on something we have. So they want a thing we have, and they are prepared to change what they're doing to get the thing we have. They will attack us and they will adapt. The problem there is, however we model our own environments and model our own actions, they will adapt and react to what we're doing, which makes them unpredictable. And this is a significant problem and is indicative of the complex adaptive system as a whole. And my argument here is that at a macro level, over long periods of time, there is no doubt cyber is a complex adaptive system in my mind. I believe that you have valleys and peaks that look stable around low energy, low adaptive attackers. But overall, you are looking at a complex adaptive system. And if you try to manage it in any other way, you will fail. Fair enough. Is that a fair summary, Mario?
Yeah, sounds great. So another key concept with regards to complexity theory in Cynefin is that of affordance, right? So beware of the professionals, whether security or not, that go into an organization knowing all of the answers, right, and what the strategy needs to look like before fully appreciating the affordances that are provided by the environment they're in, right? So if we go into any organization knowing all the answers up front because we did it elsewhere, then we blind ourselves to attain the situational awareness that will help us make sense if the particular environment we find ourselves in can afford the changes we're about to embark on, right? And at that point, we're not being any better than the canned consulting approaches with one size fits all, right? Which is never the answer for something which is an emergent property of a system, as we were talking about. So in a nutshell, affordance is what the environment offers the individual. So there are lots of strategies and interventions that may not be available to you as your environment may not provide you with that affordance. And when that is the case, then we need to rethink proximate objectives or what needs to be addressed first before a particular strategy is available to us, right? Or choose something else entirely, which our environments can actually afford. Right, and we're going to be this issue of affordances is really very important when we talk about domain models. So finally, we're at the Cynefin framework, which is so Cynefin framework is a typology, right? So it's a way to look at reality. So it has 5 domains, which maps to the 3 types of systems that we discussed. So complex, chaotic, and ordered. But it divides ordered systems into 2. So it's complicated and clear. But this distinction is, as we'll see, is not as significant as the distinction between the other ones because it only relates to the expertise of the decision maker. Right? As Cynefin framework is a framework to be seen from the perspective of the decision maker. So let's start with the domain in the middle, which is AC, aware and confused. So it used to be called disorder up to, I think, 2 or 3 months ago, but it's now been updated and I'm using now the new terminology. So now we have a clear separation between being aware, which implies legitimate confusion, which allows for transition. So we know we're in that middle we are aware that we are there, and so there are ways to get out of it, from being confused. And confused is what relates to what was the previously disorder, which is about being ontologically ignorant. What I mean by that is that we don't know the nature of the situation or system we're dealing with, so that greatly increases the likelihood of us making the wrong decision. Because at that point, as Phil was mentioning, we may be coming up with solutions for solutions that have the nature of solutions for the clear domain when we're actually dealing with a complex problem, right? Or something along those lines. So being ontologically ignorant is never a good place to be because we will we're more likely to make the wrong decisions on how to treat a particular problem. So in both clear and complicated, there is a linear relationship between cause and effect. So the main difference is that in the clear domain, everyone sees that relationship and no one disputes it. So it's things like we clean our hands because we know we can get sick if we don't. Okay, so it's that type of thing. So in clear, what we do is sense, categorize, and then respond. right? So we sense the type of system we're in, we put it in a box, so we classify it, and then we respond accordingly. So in cybersecurity, I think long passwords fall under this category, right? Well, we don't need to, this day and age, we don't need to be telling anyone that they should be choosing a long password. That's kind of self-evident, no one challenges. So playbooks and runbooks are things that can come in here. In solutions like signature-based anti-malware is also this type of control. Right? The challenge is that when we over-constrain, we get a collapse into chaos. Right. So if you look at the Cynefin framework, that rounded thing at the bottom, that's what it represents. Is that when you usually when a clear system fails, it fails catastrophically and they fall into chaos. So for instance, a signature in a Navy-based system, which is too generic, or what I'd call all the bad security advice on password management of the last 20 years, which we got people forcing them to change passwords every 10 minutes. And what actually happened was it led to poorer choices of passwords because people started to think that I need to add one in a couple of months. So it actually led to the creation of worse passwords as a result, right? Again, treating a problem not according to its nature. And this is the domain also of best practices. So the classic example that Dave Snowden usually talks about is on how even on a clear system should allow for exceptions if they're properly constructed. Right. So, for instance, driving in our lane in any country. So one would not expect to go to jail if we swerved our cars to go to the wrong lane in order to avoid hitting a child or any person, right? Though everyone knows which lane that we should be driving on. That's a clear problem, right? But going to jail because we swerved to not to go over someone would be zombie-like enforcement of rules. Right, and that's also when it's well constructed, a clear problem will allow for some exceptions. And this is also the domain where we have fixed constraints. So where we should define things such as checklists or best practices. Right? In the complicated domain, it's not self-evident except for the experts. Right, so this is the domain of expertise. So when we practice our expertise, which is cybersecurity, generally things fall here as the decision makers turn to us when they don't know what the right thing to do is, right, in this domain. That's why they hire us. So the decision makers know there is a solution or an approach, they just don't know it themselves, right? But they know what they need to do, they need to ask us. So the decision model here is sense, analyze, and respond. So what we do is we apply good practices, which are not the best practices, because what we do as experts is we analyze the situation, we see what are the good practices that we can apply that make sense in the context of the thing that we are analyzing. And so we analyze data, we ask questions, and then we provide a direction, right? It's us as experts exercising our expertise. But herein lies a big problem as well. Is that we as experts, we can be relied on when the problem lies within the bounds of our expertise. But if the problem is a complex one, what we should be doing is create hypotheses, right? And hypotheses can be wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the nature of an hypothesis. It can be wrong or not. It can be better or worse, right? But it's still an hypothesis. And one thing that Dave Snowden says a lot is that if we treat a complex system as complicated and the experts get it wrong, we lose trust in expertise. And that's the biggest problem here, right? Is then when we're trying to exercise our expertise, thinking that we are dealing with a complicated problem, and we just say this is what we should do, and we get it wrong, then people stop trusting us less, and that's how we lose trust with our key stakeholders. Right? So in the complicated domain, what we have are governing constraints, right? So governing constraints create like boundaries, right? On the outside, they give you some flexibility to go within them, and they define some outer boundaries where things can happen. And this is opposed to the clear domain where the constraints are fixed and rigid. So more like checklists, etc. So the best cybersecurity example that I can give on this is how most InfoSec teams write policies which actually dictate approaches as opposed to only setting high-level control objectives. And that leaves our technical, so when we define policies as only as control objectives, we define those governing constraints and boundaries, and then the technical teams can work within them to find what's best for them. Right? The problem is when we define policies that go into much more than just setting control objectives, and I've seen many organizations which do this, we over-constrain the system, and that's when we can start having the problems that I've mentioned earlier. People starting to gain the system or finding ways around on how to make it work. So one thing about this is that if this is you, if these are your policies, not just defining control objectives, the first thing taken out of this is consider reducing the verboseness of those security policies, right? Because you risk over constraining your system and potentially come to fail catastrophically, right? So this is about the complicated domain. So in a complex domain, we don't know what the right solution is until we act. And because we don't have a linear relationship between cause and effect. So what we have here is the decision model, which is probe, sense, and respond. Right? So the general heuristic for the complex domain is that if we have multiple coherent and potentially conflicting hypotheses that can't be resolved in the time available to make a decision or within an acceptable timescale, what we should do is run parallel safe-to-fail experiments, and it's these experiments which reveal what's possible, right? So remember that interventions in complex adaptive systems change the system itself, okay? So in cybersecurity, this can mean potentially doing different types of experiments with CI/CD tests, getting constraints at different levels of the system, experimenting with different types of training with different teams, applying different types of constraints to business processes in different locations with limited budget allocations to each, and see which ones work best and will allow for the emergence of practices. If we do it this way, not only are we collaborating with our stakeholders saying that we're not certain. This is a complex, it has many different variables. We're trying this solution, we're going to get the feedback onto how the solution is working for us. If the system we're trying to apply this solution for allows us the affordance to make this happen, and then based on the learnings that we get from them, then we decide what a strategic direction should be. Okay. So in cybersecurity, when we change through policy or other means the ways of working of others, we can expect that those practices will change, but not necessarily in accordance with our intended change, right? So when that leads to a big problem in cybersecurity, which is the difference between work as imagined and work as done, right? We define processes assuming how people will work within it. If most of the time, if we come a year later and we go and audit that change, that business change that we've made, we will see that there are big differences between what we imagined it would happen and how the system is actually being used, right? And then that's where we get the gap thinking stuff, and we typically get covert work systems or people just not paying attention if they can get away with it, all of those. And all of that happens because A, we didn't consider the affordances that the system was giving us, and B, we potentially try to over-constrain the system that is naturally constrainable. Okay. And the problem is sometimes we even double down on this, right? Which is if we find that things aren't working, we add even more constraints, making it even worse, right? And that is again not treating the system in accordance with its nature. Okay. So here in the complex domain, constraints should be enabling constraints. So they're more like rules of thumb, as opposed to governing constraints of the complicated domain where we define some boundaries. So we should aim to find ways to identify the natural constraints which exist in the day-to-day narratives of people and try to take advantage of those and attach teaching stories to them. So instead of, for instance, coming in and saying, this is how we need to change our processes, or this is how we need to change our heuristics, the way you approach looking for a third-party library to get into your code, for instance. What we can potentially do instead is to first find ways of how people do it in their day-to-day work, get an actual understanding of what it takes to get the job done, how people go through it, and then find a way, okay, maybe we can make this small change, which is a very slight change from what you already do, but it's not me telling you this is the whole new way because I thought of a process flow of how you should be doing your work, right? So it's that type of difference in terms of how we approach the problem. So in terms of this idea with rules of thumb on how we can approach this, so the US Marines, for instance, they have the rules of thumb, which is capture high ground, stay in touch, keep moving, right? So that's kind of the heuristics. If they don't have someone telling them, now you need to go to point B, they've got these 3 sets of heuristics that help them make decisions when they are on the field, right? When they're doing their work. So I think in cybersecurity, we could start experimenting with some of these ideas. So something that I've been tweeting about and hoping to get a bit more feedback is heuristics such as secure dependencies, protect your secrets, scan your code, harden your config. Right. So I'm not giving a checklist. You need to pass all of these processes and do all of these things in these different areas of your CI/CD pipeline. I'm just, let's have conversations, right? These are the 4 heuristics, and everything else. Me as the professional, me as the expert, I can help you fill in any gaps that doesn't give you, right? But I don't have still any results to. This is something that I've been thinking in the past few weeks. So as a final note, we should not define goals in a complex adaptive system, because gap thinking is not going to work, because we don't have this let's call it linear relationship between cause and effect. So what we should do instead is think about vector measurements, right? Is the system evolving in the direction that I want it to go, right? So and that's how we how we deal with this. So in the chaotic domain, there's no pattern, right? Because there are no constraints. So if I want to deliberately move things into the chaotic domain, I just get rid of constraints, typically in a sandpit, if I'm not kind of really having to go all in, let's say. And so here, what we do is act, sense, respond, right? And this is also where we can find novel practices. So removing constraints and then seeing how the system itself evolves. So Phil, would you want to add something?
Sure. So some of the ways that I have thought about this in my work in security is that the clear domain is a great place for compliance. This is where my checklists for known problems that I can say to somebody, if A happens, do B. It's a very simple thing. And compliance works well there because you don't have to think about it. You know what the answer is. Complicated domain, the domain of experts, as Mario has said, this is my threat modeling. This is my risk assessments. This is, if I'm going to go into it and I don't want to, maturity assessments. This is where my experts hold forth on what the right thing to do is. What I find interesting in the complex domain, so when you're truly in that space where it is unordered, that's when you start seeing techniques like threat hunting. You know, I think we've been hacked, or if we have been hacked, what would it look like? You start seeing more resilience techniques. If we assume we've been hacked, what would survival look like? And it's a lot more about experimentation. It's a lot more about, you know, chaos engineering. Let's break something and see what happens, although that's edging into chaos. The chaotic domain is very clearly that where you end up on the first 5 minutes of any incident. So in the middle of a security incident, someone turns up and tells you that everything you thought you knew about your system has just changed. And that's when you try to start locking things down. You start saying things like, let's stop data going out of that pipe, turn it off. Let's disable all the systems we don't need. Let's back off all of the changes that have just knocked us over. You know, you start taking actions by which you limit and change the environment, and hopefully you leave the chaotic domain back into one of the others. And you know, that's one of your main goals in the middle of a crisis is just, how do I get this domain out of this domain? How do I get to there's some working constraint of some sort? But yeah. Okay.
So there was something on this diagram that I didn't mention, but the green things have a meaning. So that is called liminality within Cynefin. So what that means is there are particular sets of, and we're going to talk through what liminality is in the domain models, but just for you to understand the representation. So in that sense, that's where we can go, for instance, as Phil was saying, into the liminal chaotic area in order to experiment, to do all of those things, remove constraints, but in a controlled way so that we can go back into complex if we need to, right? So there are a few techniques that we're going to be looking into on how we can approach this.
Sorry, Mario, just one more thing about that slide. I think one of the things that we've seen in cybersecurity has been the rise and fall of compliance, the rise and fall of risk, and the rise and fall of hunting and instrumentation and resilience thinking. And we veered from one to another, and they've not worked fully. They've worked for a problem, but they've not worked for full management. So we throw compliance out and we say no more checklists, everything must be a risk. And then after a while we realize we're spending a huge amount of money analyzing and understanding things that we already know. Why am I risk assessing patches? I know I just have to patch things. And suddenly we throw out risk and we go, well, that's it, we're going to be resilience engineers from here on out, and then suddenly everything's expensive. I think one of the key things that the Cynefin framework shows us in security is that we weren't wrong when we did any of these things. What we were wrong was concentrating on one at the expense of the other. Compliance doesn't fix all, risk and threat modeling doesn't fix all, resilience practices don't fix all. Applying the right techniques to the right problems is how we improve what we're doing. And that's really been the focus of my work with Cynefin.
That is what Cynefin is about, right? It's applying, understanding the problem domain that we're in and applying the right types of methods to deal with the nature of the problem. Right, so this is what I mean by this is the tyranny of expertise, right? What we've been talking about. So the problem is, because we are experts, we feel we operate very well in the complicated domain, and we try to put complicated solutions that are good for complicated into all types of problems, whether they are clear problems, whether they're complex or chaotic. We come up with our checklists, with our processes, with all of those things, trying to govern cybersecurity when really we should be trying to first understand the type of problem we're dealing with and finding the right solution for it. I particularly like that quote from Dave Snowden, which is, it's not about cybersecurity, but a reality in cognitive science is that we assess a situation based on how we've already decided to act. And this affects everyone on the planet. This is a human thing, not a cybersecurity one. But we as security professionals, we should be wary of the default ways that we tend to deal with problems, right? And that's again about some of the ways that each of the individual leaders come up with solutions. For instance, a risk management leader will have a certain way of dealing with things. An ex-developer or leader will tend to deal with problems a different way. A business CISO will deal with it yet with a different way. And it's not that they are wrong, right? Their approaches will be very good, but they need to be applied in context.
Mario, we've got a question on the chat. What about disorder?
Yes. So in terms of the AC domain, it's no longer called disorder. It's we at the end, I've got a slide just talking about how to exit from disorder. So that's in the last bits. From aware, right? Confused. It's not separated into two, right? So aware and confused. So confused is about being ignorant of the type of thing that you are working with. The aware is where you know you still don't know the answer, but you know you need to find it, right? And that was exactly why the development of disorder to AC was done, was exactly to bring more clarity on what you can do to get out of aware. Right, but we've got some slides at the end to talk about that. Right. So in terms of heuristics of managing in complexity, so there are three sets of three, right? That things that we can do in complexity. First, there we've got three questions. So the first one is, what can I change, right? So what can it means exactly that. It means looking at our system and seeing what are things that I can change. That relates to a lot of different things. It can relate to political capital. It can relate to budget. It can relate to the relationships that you foster within your organization. It can relate to the technologies that you can implement, how integrated those technologies can be. So it's about what are the things that I can change, right? Out of those, where can I monitor any impact? Right. So where can I put something where if I make a change, I can see how it affects the complex adaptive system that is our organizations. Right. And out of those, where can I amplify success or dampen failure? So one thing on the nature of complex adaptive systems, because we don't have this linear relationship between cause and effect, we don't know in advance the results that we want, that we're going to get. So we should be always aiming to understand if things start going in the wrong direction where we don't want it to go. We need to think about these feedback loops in advance to see where we can either amplify success or dampen failure. And that's why we do multiple parallel safe to fail experiments so that we can understand what those are. Then we've got three principles. Right? So the first principle is optimize the granularity. So sometimes we're looking at a problem or at a particular system, and we are not quite sure in terms of the different pieces of it where they fit or what type of domain we're looking at. So usually we will want to drill down into. Generally, we want to make it smaller, right? Reduce into the different pieces that make its constitution, and then deal with each of them separately. Right, so this is where some of the systems thinking type approaches work well to help us with it as well. The other principle is distribute cognition over the diverse sensor networks. So this is where we should be having lots of different sensors, and sensors doesn't mean the technology aspect of it, right? It may be getting feedback from people, getting feedback from customers, we should be distributing our cognition over diverse parts of the system that we have control over or that we can influence, so that we gather all that feedback to understand the effects that it's having on it. And the last one, in terms of principles, is to disintermediate the decision maker. So when we are in this type of situation, the decision maker shouldn't necessarily be making the decisions, right? And this is where delegating or making sure that the people that are typically understand the problem better are empowered to make decisions. Obviously, we still need to understand in where we can amplify success and dampen failure as well. And then there are also three things to avoid. One of them is retrospective coherence, because hindsight does not lead to foresight. Right? And that is the problem with everything, almost, where we get to a certain situation and then we say, okay, I know why this happened. And we look at all of the evidence and we say it was this happened, and that happened, and that happened. And that's how we got to where we are today. But that's not helpful because hindsight does not lead to foresight. And another thing to understand is, even if you were to understand that something could happen, the environment could have not allowed you to make a decision. Okay, so for instance, giving an example that Dave Snowden sometimes gives as well. When we had 9/11 happening in the US, one of the things that it was mentioned was they had some data that could have potentially told them that something like that was going to happen. Right? And one of the controls that it was mentioned that they could have done was, if we had seen that there were some people being trained to lift off but not to land planes, then maybe we could have understood that meant that they were learning how to pilot but not actually land. So that could have told us they were going to crash somewhere. The question that was also asked to the political leaders was, we could have put a control in place where military could have shot down civilian planes that were acting wrongly. Right? But the question is, would a politician make that call without having the precedent of something like 9/11? The system would not have afforded them to make that decision just because there were some indicators that was not a decision that was available to him, right? It just wasn't. And I think that type of thinking we need to apply also into our organizations. Just because we may have some data that points in some directions, making some decisions may not be available to us, right? Because the system doesn't afford us to make them. So the other thing to avoid is premature convergence on a decision or an assessment. So one of the things that we're going to talk about in the domain models is how we can, because we're doing, ideally in complex systems, doing multiple safe-to-fail experiments, we should not allow it to go into the complicated domain, so meaning constraining it more, etc., to go into complicated, because we want to make sure that we fully understand the things that modulate the changes that we're making. So the more we can keep it in the liminal areas so that we can check for stability, etc., the more we can, so we shouldn't jump to conclusions in applying kind of recipes to these types of issues. And the final one is avoiding pattern entrainment of past success or failure. So what I was kind of alluding to previously. Making sure that we first try and understand the nature of the problem and not just come in with this is the solution to this type of problem because I've seen it in the past, or this is how I like to treat problems, so this is what I'm going to do about it, right? So in these the three sets of three of managing in complexity. So what we have now is we're going to talk through the domain models. So we're going to go through the 4 of them. So the 4 outer domains, let's call it. So this is the chaotic model, the main model. So in the chaotic domain, when entered accidentally, it's a problem, and we need to get out of it as quickly as possible. But when we do it deliberately, it can be a great source of innovation. Right? So here we have on one side awareness of entry, which ranges from being deliberate, so I chose to go there, from being plausible. So it's a scenario that I could foresee, though I may not have planned for it. And finally, unimaginable, right? I didn't expect I'd be facing this situation. On the other side, we have our ability to constrain the situation, right? So because the way out of chaos is through constraints. So known in that I know what needs to happen here, known as I can work out what I can or I should do to constrain this, or unknowable, right? It's completely out of my imagined scenarios and I need to hold on tight and hope I can survive it. So those are kind of the lenses to look at it. So the boundary with complex is managed innovation. So we went there on purpose by removing or relaxing constraints, and we know how to introduce them if things start getting out of hand. Right? Next, we have activate planned response. And this is where our crisis and breach management plans come into play, right? In that top, I didn't think it would happen, but I can understand what needs to be done, right? So that's what seize the day means. And seize the day is a huge opportunity for us in cyber, as we can sometimes use the opportunity to introduce measures or initiatives that would otherwise we may not have had the political capital to make happen before an incident. Right, so capitalizing on incidents to make changes that we identified is it's what that box is. It's about seizing the day and innovating. Obviously, from a business point of view, and this is not a cybersecurity model. This is a way of thinking about the world. It may have the things. It's where companies can go in to radically innovate new products, new services, enter new markets, those kinds of things. So Dave Snowden recommends actually having an innovation team which triggers in parallel with crisis management teams. So we can be more deliberate about making the most of crisis situations. Further down are the dangerous bits. So authoritative pullback and rethink happens when we relax the constraints even further and are having difficulty understanding how to manage it. So it's a bit dangerous, but it's still okay. The last part, it's Duffer's better dead. And it's about throwing away all of the constraints without being prepared to manage it. And that's silly, right? So Duffer's better dead is a reference to a famous telegram. So Duffers means someone incompetent or mediocre. in that the situation was a mother sends a telegram to the father who was in the Navy. So this was back in the 1920s. So he can approve or disapprove their children to go spend the weekend alone on a lake. Right. And what the father responds is, if not duffers, they won't drown. If duffers, better drowned. Right. So we shouldn't go there. It's a bad place to be in. But that's kind of the reference. So Last Chance Saloon is where I found myself a number of times, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well. So this is where we had a plan on how to deal with the situation, but we are not getting the results we would expect from our planned responses, right? So this is where we need to get control very fast, or we're going to be in a lot of trouble soon. Right? If things deteriorate further into the unimaginable, we're into full crisis management in innovation, where only a select group of 1, 2, or 3 individuals should be making any type of decisions, and no delegation is allowed, right? Because this is potentially life ending, or potentially career ending, whatever we want to see it, or business ending. So the decision maker needs to tightly control this. So ride the flow and pray happens when something is plausible and unknowable, right? And interfering can actually make things worse, right? So what you do here is you sit down, you wait for conditions to change or the situation unfold until we're ready to introduce changes again. And finally, the place most wish we didn't have to go there is death and rebirth. So it may be that you just need to let it die quickly, so something can emerge from it, or we can take the learnings elsewhere and start over. Right? Some businesses often find themselves in this type of situation. So holding on to things past their usefulness isn't helpful for anyone, and accepting failure is a skill in and of itself. So the 4 boxes to the right, Last Chance Saloon, Activate Planned Response, Managing Innovation, and Authoritative Pullback and Rethink, that's the liminal. So that's the green part between the chaotic and the complex domain. So this is the complex domain model. So in the complex domain, we don't have direct causal relationships. So we have to have some degree of evidence so that our hypothesis can be coherent or have some coherence, and it has to have a degree of acceptance. Otherwise, the context will not provide the decision maker the affordance to make a decision in that direction into experiment, right? I'll refer back to the 9/11 example that I was giving earlier on. So on the nature of evidence, it can be beyond reasonable doubt in that it's been proven and should soon be ready to move to complicated. It's inductive, so meaning there are several cases in that it works and you can prove it. And finally, it's gut feel, in that no one really knows. It may look and sound coherent, but it's too early to tell for sure. The complex domain has on one side also the degree of acceptance, right? So this is where can be the cognoscenti. So there's a few elite people that understand the problem, and it's kept as such. It can become orthodox in that most people accept the thing. And finally, synchrony, which is a term coming from the resilience literature, which largely means that everyone is walking in step and there's no descent, right? So this may mean that it's also ready to be moved into the complicated domain. So in the middle, we have projects and initiatives, which are experiments with coherence that you're keeping there in order to test and improve its stability, as we should do in the complex domain. So that's the liminal, the beginning of the liminal part. However, a lot of the good ideas on how to address complex problems go to the bottom. Okay, a few know what to do, but nobody will or wants to believe them, right? So this is where we find the heretics and mavericks. So people that were seeing the benefits of DevOps from a security point of view 10 years ago, those would have been the heretics and the mavericks. And they often lack the language and the communication skills to get higher degrees of acceptance. So we need mediation techniques to move something from there. Right. So one of the ways to manage this is through sandpits and skunkworks. So in cyber, this may mean hiding an initiative from most of the company, get your heretic to work with a select few on a side project that no one else knows about to prove and stabilize it. So transparency is not the way to go here, right? As the internal inertia may kill any chance of success And others, if they start seeing that their worldviews, the way that they prefer to deal with problems, is getting attacked, they may work to actively undermine it, right? So here, this is where we should not be talking about through the whole organization about this, because that can dictate its failure. So another strategy is coaching and mediation, right? Where we don't know if it will work or not, but the heretic can help interpret it. And we can get a select few working together to explore these ideas and their implications, and also have that start creating on the side that broader support network that can help disseminate and convince other people. Right? So this is kind of an indirect route, in that convincing particular stakeholders may be difficult, but if you convince people that the key stakeholders trust first, it greatly increases your chance of future success. So at the top, we have groupthink, which is dangerous. So everyone is in step, but based on gut feel. So in cyber, a lot of people in our industry are in this space, right? The move to that DevOps has them thinking that way. So the gut feel tells them that releasing software that often is certainly going to lead to more vulnerabilities, to security breaches. So the thinking usually goes, if when we did it slowly, things weren't very good, it's only going to get much worse when we accelerate, right? But hopefully the audience that we have will know that's not actually the case. And now from, a bit of controversy. So we've got two ways to deal with that, right? If we see that happen, we need to break it fast. Right, and that may mean that the best thing for your organization, again, remember that Cynefin framework is to be seen from the point of view of the decision maker. If you find yourself with groupthink, one of the options available that you need to consider is potentially letting go of your whole security team, right, or at least a lot of its elements. As a leader, you sometimes need to make hard decisions. A bit less dramatic is to stop having those people work together. So you integrate them for a season directly in other teams, or you change them around. You do something along those lines. Another strategy is to also to challenge the evidence if there's more proof to it. So this is where intensive training can come in as well. So what we would do there, we unpick assumptions that both have about the job of security, how security actually works. So no longer being behind the screen sending emails, but actually collaborating with other teams. And we think about the type of conditions that would be required to release multiple times a day. So we're at that point, we're no longer just saying, these are my requirements. We're telling people, this is what I would like to see in order to trust the process more, right? And having that approach so until it's ready for exploitation. So an example of from myself on how I've had to deal with a situation like this. So working for a big corporate, I had a big team, and there was very much ingrained groupthink, right? There was complete disregard for DevOps as a thing. People just really wanted to have their processes and have everyone in the organization follow them. So we started getting into DevOps. We got a new exec that came in and said on the first day, we're moving to DevOps and it's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months, right? And that wasn't going to work. I didn't have the right team to support any of that. And with just 3 months, I also didn't have the time to train everyone, right? But it just wasn't possible without people feeling directly threatened by everything that I did as a leader. So basically, in order to help prepare the situation, I had to find ways of people understanding that what they were bringing to the table and that the new context was no longer what we needed. So some of them ended up leaving. And what I also did was, because I didn't have an heretic, I went to the market to get one. I got a contractor, someone that already done this in the past. He was a bit forceful in how he approached things, and that was exactly the type of person that I needed to help me through that situation. Instead of putting him with the rest of the team, what I did was I hired him and put him sitting with the DevOps transformation team away from everyone, and then we got some actual good success on adopting some of these practices. Right? So this is an anecdote on how I used some of these things to go through problems.
So Mario, one thing I was just going to say, I may have come across on the Open Security Summit as quite ranty about the state of the security industry. I am convinced that if you looked at the security industry from a long way away, it's gut feel and orthodoxy.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm in the case where you need to break up the security industry right now and build something better.
Yeah, I cannot disagree, generally speaking, but yeah, it depends on the scale that we're looking at the problem, right? So that was about the complex domain. So anything else you'd like to share on that, Phil?
No, I mean I've had great experiences like you have, where taking existing teams into a new world required heretics. It required breaking groupthink. It required breaking up teams and reforming. So there's a lot here that you fall into sometimes because you have to, and it's really helpful to see it laid out sometimes as a pattern that you can follow.
Yeah, definitely agree. Okay, so let's move on to the complicated domain. So the complicated domain is where we have expertise and analysis, right? So the two dimensions here are breadth of engagement, so the number of people we involve, and also the strategic focus. So not necessarily strategic focus for the company, but strategic focus for us as the security leaders, right? So the rule of thumb here is, for leaders is that when you can move out of the complex domain and constrain the problem so it's complicated, ideally you want to be delegating this to either your junior managers or to your other team members, generally speaking. So the breadth of engagement ranges from just a few key people being involved. Breadth of engagement ranges from consent needed when everybody needs to buy in, and is required to move it into the clear domain, building agreement, and having only a few number of people involved. Right? So in strategic focus, it ranges from forming, becoming operational, and being fully exploitative and ready to be turned into the clear domain. So I'm going to use threat modeling as an example throughout this domain. So threat modeling was once complex without any true methods behind it. It was something that people did intuitively, some of the heretics and mavericks that we saw on the thing. But then Adam Shostak had some iterations. He wrote a book. He started to help stabilizing some of the practices and frameworks. In that the frameworks then emerged, and security professionals started using it as a method. Right. So up until then, the only thing we had was really the risk analysis and the risk analysis processes. So in cyber, we can think of this when first introducing threat modeling, we may want to start with some key people only, right? Building expertise within the security team, for instance, right? Before we are ready to start getting the rest of the organization through that type of learning. So here we focus on opportunities, and focus on opportunities, excuse me, is about introducing in a few projects. So we don't have any type of governance or anything like that still. What we do is find an opportunity where a big project or a project where we've got a project manager that is more keen to working with us. And we try to introduce this where we have the affordance to do so. And we just go ahead and do it. So particularly in companies that have a culture of being reticent about security introducing practices, over publicizing it too soon gives some the opportunity to potentially sabotage it. But so when that progresses, after we have a few examples and a few opportunities where we had good results, then we have the check for stability. Right. And we shouldn't rush this. So that's why there's a red dot in there. So on the check for stability, you may need to leave that there months or even years, okay, depending on how things go. Because we need to understand how what works, and also how our organization can adopt the practice within its dynamics. So after we consider it stable in producing the intended results, we can then constrain them to move to an operational process. Okay, and then we have the edges. So at the bottom. So at the bottom we have the longitude problem. So in short, that refers to what happened when a British furniture maker found a novel way to measure longitude, and he had both a theory and a valid scientific validation. Right? The problem is that no one believed them because that wasn't the type of solution that the scientific community was expecting. So it took years to get any type of acceptance. So the cautionary tale here is that even if you're right and you can prove that a particular course of action is preferable, it doesn't mean that you're going to get acceptance in the organizations to introduce threat modeling for all projects, for instance, if we're talking threat modeling. To address this, we have a low risk and a high risk strategy. So we can either pull back or engage early. So that is potentially drop the idea, wait for a period or a situation that gives you the affordance to reintroduce it again, and try to describe it differently later, right? And then you reintroduce it. This could be, for instance, if the CTO or whatever is the case isn't particularly keen on US security introducing new processes, you may find that you don't have the business the affordances in your context to actually make it happen. And there's the high risk strategy, which is put power at risk. So for instance, if the CTO isn't giving you permission to work with the different technical teams to introduce threat modeling, you may go to the CEO, go around to try and force it, right? If you really want to make it happen. So those are kind of the two strategies that you could potentially use if you find yourself in that type of situation. At the top, we've got time wasters. So this is where things are only in the hands of a few key people. So it's ready to be exploited, but they just won't let go, right? So instead of focusing on simpler methodologies, for instance, for threat modeling, that's where you can have a team of security people who keep on using and practicing full of jargon and complicated models, and they are forcing the practice to always happen in their presence or with their approval. Right, so people are holding on to that practice and aren't letting it become something that is more in the clear domain for everyone else. So when this happens, again, you've got two strategies to potentially deal with that. You can try and break the team, holding on to it, so increasing diversity, so they can hold on to it as a unit, right? Because usually these things are self-reinforcing on the team's daily narratives and how they talk with each other, right? Or the other strategy is take it off their hands, right? Have them define the standards for the practice, and they no longer can hold on to it, right? So those are the two things. And then after you define all of these standards and enforce, you can bring it into constraint to operational process and then move it into the clear domain. So you're seeing obvious there because some of these slides, it was only changed recently, a couple of months ago. So, but the new name is clear. It's no longer obvious, but they're effectively the same thing. It just had a redress about a couple of months ago. So the theme in the complicated domain is that it has a lot of it has to do with power, typically supported by specialist knowledge in the form of political capital in the organization, which needs to be managed and considered. So the stuff at the bottom mainly, or power in the form of knowledge, of technical jargon, etc. There are teams can sometimes, they may not do this on purpose, it may just be the dynamics of how things evolved. But with regards to what they perceive their roles to be in the organization and what feels comfortable to them, right? So I've got also an anecdote here to tell. So I had a situation when I was managing a team. So I had 6 engineers onshore and 4 engineers offshore in a team in India. So what happened was I joined the company, and a couple of months later, I realized 2 things. The first one was that our COO was being managed on how much work we got our front offices, the teams in India, to do in terms of ticket volumes of the stuff we needed to do. Completely contrary to this, we had a situation where my team, the 6 engineers I had onshore, was spending 40 to 50% of their time doing firewall changes. And then they were telling me they were too busy with work, so they couldn't do any maintenance work. I got a bit upset about the whole situation, as you may imagine. So on one hand, we're not meeting the exact objectives. And on the other hand, I had very expensive onshore engineers in the UK doing firewall changes when I had a perfectly capable team in India that already had a defined process. So things were very constrained in terms of the steps that it needed to do. And I had no way to justify why I had very expensive engineers doing firewall changes. Right? So what happened there is I got a lot of inertia, not only from my team, because what happened was the team dynamics was that the designers and the people that were taking care of the network designs, etc., they were coming to my team's desks and they were spending kind of hours on end just chatting whilst my team were doing firewall changes. Right? So when I put in the constraint of telling them, my engineers will not be doing any firewall changes anymore. There was, I even, and I'm not even joking, the design manager even threatened, you were hitting me in the face, right? It went to that type of engagement. But basically I knew what I had to do and I was going to do it anyway. He didn't hit me, by the way. So there was a situation where we had something that was already constrained, but the team were holding on to that type of power. The dynamics weren't they had built a social dynamic within the office that they were comfortable with. So they were holding on to that type of thing, right? So we had a big situation of time wasters. So what I had to do was make sure that I review the operational processes and make sure that the teams were trained, not only trained to do the changes, but they also understood the governance process and how the heuristics on what they could and could not do in terms of the firewall changes. And then I passed that on to them. And actually, as a result, I got because firewall changes were a big part. This was in a telco, so it was a big volume of changes, and I actually got having personal distinction from the CEO and the COO because I helped the whole of the back office actually achieve the numbers, which were in the challenge of not meeting them because we were holding on to a lot of them. So this is my experience on with the complicated domain. Phil, would you like to add something here?
I think you've covered that one well. I don't have any better anecdote than you have.
Cool. So now we are on to the cleared model. So this is the last domain that we're going to cover. So this is only for things that will be highly stable for long periods of time, right? So if we don't think that something is ready to be fully constrained, then we shouldn't even be coming here. Right? And it's a better strategy to leave it uncomplicated and have the security experts dealing with the problems. But when things are pretty simple, they're standard, we can build a manual around it, we can get a checklist, then that's where we can come, because it allows us to do things such as outsourcing, it allows us to do a couple of other things with it, and also it reduces deviation. Right, and there are some processes like a firewall change management process where we don't want deviation. So we should always be aiming to be doing this in the clear domain. So here we've got two dimensions, right? We've got attitude to enforcement, because deviation is not something that we can afford, and we've got response to it. So how do people respond to it? How do they feel about it? So on attitude to enforcement, it starts with trade-off. So here there are things that matter to you, but not that much that you're going to have to do something about it, and you just compromise. So I was actually having a conversation with Dennis, I don't know if he's on the call or not, about this particular thing this morning, which is an example that he was giving was on cookie security, right? Sometimes, yes, we should be doing secure cookies, but I'm likely not going to use much of I'm going to use my political capital for other stuff, right? So it's one of those that sometimes you just, okay, I've got other stuff that I want to use my political capital on, especially if you're an early leader in an organization, right? It starts with trade-off, that part. So you just compromise, right? They're important, but not that important. The other part is self-evident. So self-evident is what it says on the tin. And finally, zombie-like is when rules are enforced regardless of the consequences, which can get us into chaos. And in response, we have questioning. So so it starts with, are we really sure? Then pragmatic, in that people just accept it. or indifferent, in that people will just do what they're told to do. Right? Here, what good looks like is that you confirm you want to do it, and then you keep it as a stable practice, right? And that's it. If things are working well, it should never move away from there. If you're needing to do anything else, it's probably either because it's not a stable practice or it shouldn't be in that domain, right? Um, so there are a couple of ways that we can think about what to do here. Basically, we want it to be self-evident and pragmatic. And if you see indifferent or zombie-like, then you've got problems that you need to deal with. But these are kind of the basic ideas. If it moves down to trade-off, it's like people don't really agree, but also don't have the energy to fight it. And this is a problem. And if it moves further down, then it's not even, there's not even any questioning. They just do whatever you as the leader tell them to do. And this should tell you you are probably failing your team if that's the case, right? Because if that's how people feel about it, there's probably issues with feeling that they're heard or even psychological safety, right? If you're not the problem, then you should create a challenge and work out what's happening. And if it doesn't work, you're looking at complacency-induced failure, and you may fall into chaos. Right? The other side tends to be more common. So you think it's self-evident, but there's a group who is still questioning. So the best way to manage this is to listen and walk the talk. Right. So here you test the ideas for yourself, you go through the processes to try and understand what the concerns are, and then you address them. Right. The cynics are those that keep questioning, but follow the rules zombie-like. But remember that cynics are those who care. Right. And especially with people who've been in service long, you should really listen, and maybe you've moved too soon into the clear domain. I remember at a big corporate getting to the point just telling everyone in the team and my manager, your process is making me lose close to a day a month doing expenses. If that's what you think my time is well spent on, that's on you. I'm not going to argue anymore. But I made it a case of telling him every month, today is my expense day. So today you're not allowed to ask me for anything, right? It's those kinds of processes in dynamics. What you can also get is gaming behavior. Right? So when people understand the scope of the rules and work around them or at its limits. So for instance, I've worked with a customer that they had to click a specific field in Jira so it would go to CAB for security to review, because they were perceived as kind of useless, only about 5% of what should go there actually would. Right? So people would just pretend and apologize later if they had to. And this is kind of the what happens in the clear domain. So another anecdote about the clear domain. So I worked at another big corporate where I was also responsible for the firewall change process. So I had both cynics and sycophants everywhere. So the process was appalling, right? It was super expensive. I actually wrote a blog post about it on how I saved the company £1 million, something along those lines. It's in my blog. So what happened was it was super expensive. There was some evidence of gaming behavior. So people actually pushing what would be BAU, business as usual, firewall changes through projects because they already had CapEx code. They didn't have to engage a different team, etc. So what I had to do in that situation was to pull back and engage early. So I got together a group of people who I knew were cynics, but I knew they cared. They just were very unhappy with the service that they were getting. I got them to kind of establish a forum where I could capture kind of how I'd say it, officially capture from them what were their feelings or what their approaches to the process and what wasn't working for them. And basically I dealt with some of the challenges that I made some suggestions. I changed the process again to deal with the concerns that they had. And then I established a new best practice that was now working for everyone. And that as a result of that, I actually saved the company over £1 million a year. There were a lot of firewall changes happening in this space. So yeah, that was how I approached the situation. I pulled it back, engaged early, dealt with some of the concerns. I found clear strategies to deal with the issues that we were finding, to establish a new stable best practice, which was both pragmatic and self-evident, right? And that's where we want stable best practices to be. Anything to add there, Phil?
I was just going to use a slightly backward example where I used a cost-saving exercise to get people to do things. I was working in a large multi-enterprise data environment, lots of legacy protocols that had no authentication. We were building a new centralized data store, which would have brought in new enterprises that most of the people in the legacy environment didn't trust. They fought me tooth and nail on upgrading legacy protocols to include authentication, the cost of which was too far. They wouldn't do it. Fine. I sat down, I looked at our estimated usage profiles, and I worked out that actually the several millions of pounds that we were investing, and when I say several, it was two figures, on the authentication mechanism, was only looking at about 15% of the traffic, which was coming from outside. So I made a formal case to have an unauthenticated data repository, because why would we bother spending tens of millions of pounds to protect something that from 15% of the traffic? This upset a lot of people who decided we couldn't not have authentication. And suddenly the legacy behavior became or the legacy costs became something that could be challenged. Yep. But sometimes you just have to turn those cost savings on their head just to make a point.
Yeah, completely agree. Right. So this was it for the different domains. So this is kind of a view of how all of the domains connect together, in how I like to think holistically about applying in cybersecurity, how to apply some of these ideas. So in the chaotic domain, we've got the place of crisis management. So when something chaotic happens, those are the things that in some methods and techniques that we talked about, and strategies on how we can potentially approach that. When things are in the complex domain, it's the time to experiment and listen, right? It's not the time to go ask for budget and spend millions of pounds on things that we don't know if we've got the business affordances to make, or that we can't really prove the value that it's going to give us because we haven't experimented and we don't know the effects they're going to have on our organization, right? Then in the complicated domain, that's where we need to be an expert. Right, that's where we need to exercise the full extent of our expertise, but also understanding that what are the boundaries of it, right? And again, and finally, on the obvious stuff, that's where we should be empowering others. This is where we should be doing the work to give other teams in the organization the agency over the things that they do, help them constrain it to operational processes. If something is complex and we can't constrain it further, then let's help them develop heuristics that they can serve as the guiding principles of how they approach the problems. And we leave the kind of the middle, the complicated stuff for our expertise, for where we learn our things, our security stuff, and we keep on evolving as the threat landscapes evolve. Right, so that was it on how you can use Cynefin in the different domain models as a generic model on how we can think about the different problem spaces and the types of strategies that we can use to help us move and get better results out of each different type of problem. What we're going to do now is look at how we can go about developing how to inform or develop a cyber strategy using some of the Cynefin principles. So the idea of scaffolding is paramount, I think, for effective cybersecurity. Now, this is critical if you're going to take the position that applications and capability should be the emergent property of the interaction between people and their artifacts within constraints. Right. So one of the things that is becoming more common as a word used in resilience engineering and other things is the socio-technical system. Right. So it's not just about and I like to think it also from the lens of social practice theory, which is not just about people, process, and technology. We need to start managing the meanings, the know-how, in the materials, so the tools, all of those things, right? We really need to think about all of these things, because that's how people will adopt or not um, the practices that we're trying to introduce. So the scaffolding provides the constraints which each need to be strong enough at the start of the process, but that should evolve as part of the evolving identity of the organization. So a scaffolding is a construct which supports the emergence of something which can sustain its identity. Now, there are organizations that may not necessarily show significant care for cybersecurity, but which have either a very mature approach to a definition of quality and operational stability, and or where the management team are conscious of market risks, project management risks, and are very apt at managing them. So when these exist, cybersecurity should be framed as an add-on to that type of scaffolding. At the type of scaffolding because that's the identity of the company. So, and if we do it like that, it will require less energy to do security things without having to frame as something which needs to stand on its own, right? And even if if we don't have those, if that's not something that our organizations do, anything that we can do to frame it as such and support our other stakeholders in building that scaffolding will pay dividends in the long run in terms of company culture. So this is a lens which I prefer to use when thinking and building security and governance processes. So let's not just think about ourselves and our immediate needs or security things, but if we can frame security as addressing the other stakeholders' problems, and we can help them create the scaffolding to do better quality, to have better operational stability, or to help the organization better manage risks against attaining objectives, then we not only will we build allies because we're helping them build the scaffolding that they need for their own objectives, but we also make the job of security easier because we can leverage that scaffolding to build the security processes from within, right? As opposed to being something that we are trying to build on top that will require much more energy and much more political capital. So another part is on robust versus resilient, right? So robust, a system is robust when it can continue functioning in the presence of internal and external challenges without fundamental changes to the original system. So robustness is all well and good until the design conditions are exceeded, and then it fails catastrophically, right? So think of a dam, think of yeah, that type of thing where they were built to a certain design conditions and they're good, they're going to work very well in that space. But when the design conditions are exceeded, that's it. It's going to fail catastrophically, and often it's going to be worse than if it wasn't there at all, right? Because the things that would have happened in the middle haven't happened. Yes, Phil?
So a really good example of this is operational technology. So, you take anything running in a lab, take something running in an oil field. Most of these things are bought 20, 30 years lifespan and originally designed to sit on private networks, not connected to anything. They're robust. The idea that somebody on the other side of the world was going to affect my fuel pipeline was laughable because they had no way to get to it. Suddenly we started putting internet connections in because it was cheaper to do remote support. And now our system is no longer robust because the assumptions we made when we built it don't stand anymore. And this is surprisingly common with those systems that we end up supporting that lived a hell of a lot longer than anyone expected and then became too risky to change. And so they live forever until they die.
Yep. So the other type is resilient, right? So a system is resilient when it can adapt to internal and external challenges by changing its methods of operations while continuing to function. So while elements of the original system are present, there is a fundamental shift in core activities that reflects this adapting to the new environment. Right? So resilience is about adaptive capacity. Right. So there's a lot of stuff that that is talked about with so chaos engineering is not resilience. It is a method that can be used to help with resilience, but resilience happens in organizations. It does not happen on technology, right? Resilience is about the operational capability, the capacity to adapt to change. And that's where humans need to come in. Yeah.
So a very simple example, and it wasn't a lot of resilience, but it was a little bit. Worked on very briefly on a very large citizen focused system for which the potential for fraud was through the roof. There was a desire to build what we called the paranoia dial. And the point there was most transactions had to be automated because we just didn't have the money to pay for the people to do these transactions manually. But we also knew we would be subject to campaigns of attack. So we built the capacity to change our system-based risk assessment of transactions. So normally it was quite high. When we felt that there was a pattern of attack underway, we could drop that boundary, and more transactions would get pushed into customer service, and more would go manual, and our costs would go up. And we had an instant plan for how we brought people into call centers and how we handled that. And it was interesting because we could talk to our stakeholders and say, when we declare an incident and we turn that dial, it's going to cost you this much more per day. And that's the cost of this risk. But it was a small amount of extra resilience so that when we got faced with large scale fraud attack, we could take it and we could handle it rather than just be overwhelmed by it and have to turn the system off.
Yep. For example, so we come something that I've mentioned a few times in this talk so far, but to the issue of constraints, right? So let's just do a quick recap on constraints for each of the system types. So this is a typology again. So don't force things to fit it. It's just to help us think and get the divergence in our own thinking and communication with others. So in an ordered system, the system itself constrains the agents, right? In a chaotic system, the system is entirely unconstrained. So our management job is to introduce constraints. And in a complex system, the system lightly constrains the agents, but when we interact with the system, we modify it. Okay, so this nature of constraints suggests how we should manage in each, and I'll try to use cybersecurity examples as much as possible. So the primary distinctions are: does the constraint contain or connect? Okay. So constraints which contain are like an exoskeleton, which defines boundaries around something. So they're likely to be governing constraints, so more suited to the complicated domain. So a constraint that contains can be, for instance, MDM software, for instance, where we get often a completely separate container from the main device to protect corporate data on a mobile phone. A constraint that connects defines interactions between entities that form part of a system. So a constraint that connects is probably an enabling constraint. So it's more suited to the complex domain. So a constraint that connects in security can be leverage an already working data protection impact assessment process, for instance, to extend it to include a security assessment too, in order to avoid business stakeholders to have to go through an additional governance process, for instance. Right. So we look at the landscape, we see what's already there, and we try to connect to our own constraints on the processes. So in the constraints can also be robust or resilient. So we've covered the difference, but now we're going to look a bit at the detail. So resilience is, Dave Snowden usually calls it, it's survival with continuity of identity over time. Right? So robust constraints can be rigid. So this means that they are defined, they're visible, and they can be enforced. Right. So there is certainty in them, but they're also subject to catastrophic failure, as we were talking about, when the limits of their design conditions are reached or exceeded. So a cybersecurity example is security policies that don't stick to defining control objectives and go into a lot of technical detail. So they define a rigid type of constraint, which is likely to be divorced from the operational reality. And as such, they create a business liability when the auditor comes in to check and realizes it's just a load of BS. or pretty words on paper without much substance, right? So that's the example of a rigid constraint. An elastic constraint can adapt to a degree of change, but can still break and give a false level of confidence. So an example in cyber would be properly written security policies, where we only define high-level control objectives, and we leave agency to our technical teams to implement them as they see fit. But this can still break due, for instance, to unawareness or misinterpreting what the policies are suggesting. Tethers are there to provide the backstop. So the usual example is think of a tow rope, right? Has a slack given to it before it applies. So they're fail safes, they are backups which only come into play in extreme situations. They can damage when snapped into effect, both itself and the object that they are protecting. So an example in cyber is I'd class, for instance, untested recovery processes fall into this category. So they're there to provide some level of comfort, but when we actually need them, experience tells me that they don't often work as we expected them to, and they sometimes create other problems when we try to follow them. So these are the different types of robust constraints. We also have resilient constraints. So and these are permeable. So these are contingent. So some things get through them and other things won't. In cyber, an example could be where we allow rules to be broken under heuristic control. So, for instance, we could define to a development team that you are allowed to deploy a system with a critical vulnerability identified as long as there isn't a known exploit for it at the moment and you plan to fix it within a week or two, right? Provided that the exploitability doesn't change, right? So this, we're not just saying this is, if it's red, we break your build, right? We're saying, look, there's a system of control, we're putting a permeable constraint, we're giving them a set of heuristics that they can work within. Then we've got conditional or mutating constraints in that they change over time and you can see an evolutionary pattern. So these aren't very common in organizations, but an example would be case-based law, right? Where the rulings are constantly adapting. So judges are making new rulings and that changes the type of constraint that the legal system puts on citizens in business. And finally, we have dark constraints. So dark constraints are like dark matter, right? So we can see their impact, but we don't exactly know what they are, right? So organizational culture falls here as the security culture. In taking a complexity approach to it, there won't be direct causal relationships on how your security culture may be good or bad, but understanding that it has an impact on potentially what are the modulators, so the things we can change, that we can use, that we can assess our changes over time is going to be important, right? So it typically your typical change program of adding tools, practices, or even your awareness won't necessarily improve this, right? It may actually have a detrimental effect. So we need to really start thinking about how we capture information in terms of these feedback loops, so we can make better, so we can apply better modulators in trying to change and having these feedback loops and understanding how the system is changing with the changes that we're making to it.
So an interesting example I came across in the States working with a healthcare provider was access to patient records in wards. Now, they had a very strong regulatory regime that said unless you were the doctor treating somebody, you shouldn't see their patient records. And, that kind of makes sense. That said, they needed a rigid constraints access control system that kept people away from that. But if somebody's crashing and the wrong doctor's in the room, they need that data. So the interface had a button that allowed any doctor to access any record they wanted to, but it was an emergency button. They were taught that it was for use in emergency only. It was alerted. There was paperwork after the fact when you'd used it, but the control was resilient. It provided access control. It provided separation of duties and concerns between doctors, but it also allowed them to cut straight through it to save someone's life. And I thought that was a great example of a rigid control that was also permeable.
Yep. For example. Do you want to talk about the attacker constraints? You're on mute.
And that took me a lot more time than normal to do that. So I'm just going to answer a quick question in the chat. Was there a deterrent in place to minimize usage of that button? It was interesting. So the use of the button was audited, an alert was sent, and there was paperwork to do. What was interesting is, doctors are mission driven. They're there to look after people. If you go and tell them, I will give you the ability to look after somebody, and I'm going to make it really annoying because you're going to have to fill a form in afterwards when you've done one of these, because they shouldn't be every day. They both took it seriously, and they were deterred by the fact they had to go and fill a form in and justify why they'd done it. And that was an important part of their management process. So there was a deterrent in place, but it wasn't to stop them doing it because in a way that would have put someone at risk. It was just to make it very clear to them, if you want this emergency access so you can save somebody, press the button. It'll happen. It'll work, but you're going to have to work on it.
Right. So then we have, going back to the question, I think it was Barbara, if I recall, talking about the web. So this is what what I promised. So being aware means that we don't really have a current understanding of the type of system that we're dealing with. So this is the information that is coming out, as Phil was mentioning on the chat that I just saw, that the new EU book for handling crisis has this information in it as well. So when we don't know the type of problem, the nature of the problem that we're dealing with, we are in the aware space, right? So we've got 6 different ways of potentially dealing with that problem. The first one at the top is conflicting the experts. So that's what it means to go into that question mark that exists over there. So what you do here is you get people from different types of backgrounds. So in cybersecurity, we could potentially get in the operational person, the architect, we get the cybersecurity person as well into the room, and they come up, each of them will have some coherent hypothesis on what we should do. And then you, as the decision maker, in this situation, the decision maker will not be the security leader, right? The security leader would be one of the experts with hypothesis, right? This means that the person above would get all of these experts into the room, and they let them fight each other, right? And see what comes out of that. They're going to see the dynamics, people arguing against the pros and cons of the different solutions, and you see if what comes out of their conversation of conflicting the experts, you see if it's something that you feel comfortable with pursuing, right? And this, I think, is something that needs to be used more often, right? In my opinion. Then another approach is to go into parallel safety file experiments. So that's the move into the complex domain. Right? Another strategy is to go into the complicated domain. So what you do is, for instance, your security guy or whatever is the case was telling you for 3 or 6 months or a couple of years that this was going to happen. Then suddenly this happened, right? What you do there is you go apologize and you give them the full authority. Okay, you told me this was coming. It's now happened. I didn't listen at the time. I didn't have, it wasn't a priority for me then. Now I'm giving you all of the authority to deal with the problem, right? Obviously, I'm talking at a high level, but this can be even within our teams, right? We've got as manager, you've got one of your direct reports who told you that something was going to happen. You didn't listen because you had other priorities or other ways to dealing with it. Then something happens and you can say, okay, you were right. So now I'm giving you the authority, go and fix it, right? Another example could be on introducing draconian constraints. So this would be more approach dealing with the chaotic, right? Where you introduce urgent constraints to deal with an issue. So a cyber example could be, let's say that something really, really, really bad happened in our organization, and we were delivering software with lots of vulnerabilities. Then we can just introduce for a while. You usually don't want to do this for long. That no more builds happen without the security person or the engineering manager approving every single change, right? So this is not something that you want to have in place for a long time, but in particular situations, this may be the right thing to do for a business in a particular context, right? And that's what kind of introducing draconian constraints means. Using a COVID example, so the way New Zealand dealt with the issue of COVID was an example of this. So the PM, she didn't wait until to get all of the scientific evidence like the US and the UK keep saying they're doing. I don't think they are, but that's another matter. So she didn't wait around to get all of the evidence saying that was the right thing to do. She immediately introduced the constraints on international flights. And what that gave her was more time to think about what she should actually be doing. So the introduction of the draconian constraint was not something that was going to expected to be there for a long time, but it served the purpose of leaving more options open for longer. Right, and sometimes as managers, that's the best thing that we can do. Is let's do something now that can keep that can have us leave more options open for longer, whilst we try and gather more data to understand what's the right thing to do here. And the one thing you should never do, which is the thing that is in dotted lines, is the nullify the process freaks. A lot of times we get problems in cyber where we come to a novel type of situation and someone says, this is the process we should be doing. It's not. If you had any type of challenge, if you had any type of concern that you didn't know the nature of the problem, the last thing you should be doing is creating a process for it, right? Because it's not the right time to do that. If anything, you first go into the complicated domain, you test out for stability, and then after things get more stable, then you can think about creating a process around it, but not before. And finally, the last one is very specific to the type of offering that Cognitive Edge, so the company that Dave Snowden owns, it's very specific to something that he provides as a software. But basically what it is, the idea behind it is a generic idea, which is what you want to do in tractable mass sense means that you will try and get narratives from across, from a big pool of people, right? It may be across your organization, across your country, whatever the scope is that we're talking about. And then you're going to try and understand where how people feel about a particular type of situation or problem. And what you do then is with some particular techniques, you try and understand where there's agreement on something and where's dissent, right? And where things go off to the edges. And typically what you want to do as a decision maker is to try and understand what are those things that everyone agrees on, what should be the course of action, and where you've got dissent, why is that dissent there? And try to focus on that dissent, because usually there's something that you can learn from the edges. Right. So this is a particular type of software that that Cognitive Edge provides that can help you get that mass sense approach to understanding narratives across your business. So, and we finally come to the last part, which is strategy analogies from nature, right? So in Cynefin, in the complexity theory, basically uses naturalizing a lot. So it uses ideas from nature to try and inform the methods and processes that we go to, that we use. So here we've got three different things, right? That relate to strategy. So parasites live off the host directly. Right. So if we're thinking about a parasite type strategy, what we are typically thinking about is what things that already exist and how can I live off of them, right, directly. So how can then we have hyena strategy. So hyenas live off what the apex predator don't want. right? So they will typically get the remains that the bigger animals got, and yeah, and basically they go into the system and they live off what it provides them, right? But they're not making the rules, right? The people who make the rules are the apex predators, right? In this instance, I put in the Yosemite wolves. Gray wolves. So the apex predators basically do what they want, right? In the apex predators can do that because they can't fail until the conditions in the environment change, right? So examples from nature would be the T-Rex, the Yosemite wolf, which in their own ecosystem, they were the top of the chain, right? And they have until the conditions change. And so what happened in Yosemite in the 1910s, 1920s, was that they were taken off of the environment. And what happened was ecological collapse of the Yosemite Park, right? Because the wolves stopped being near the shores of the rivers. It meant that all the deers and all the other animals all started going to the shores. They started procreating more. They grazed the whole soil. The soil became problematic. And the whole ecosystem kind of collapsed within a few decades. And it wasn't until I think the 90s where there was a deliberate action to reintroduce the wolves, and then the ecosystem suddenly came back to life, right? And stabilized. So an example in business would be Microsoft and Apple, right? So there was a business article a few weeks back that about a month ago, that claimed that Microsoft and Apple, they are the companies that are most agile, and that's why they are the ones doing very well in the COVID environment. Blah 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 blah. Right? That's not true. Right? They're the apex predators. There's no way that they're going to fail until the conditions on the environment fail. Right? That's what happens with apex predators. Right? And I think that looking at how we develop security strategy with these three in these three different ways is helpful, right? What I mean by this is that there's an energy gradient on how we can make about effective security change in organizations, depending on the type of strategy that we can adopt, right? So if we think more like a parasite, this can mean one of the what it can potentially mean is that we integrate into other people's transformations. So we're not necessarily trying to make security change happen. What we're doing is we are paying a lot of attention, right? And I'm going to say this again: we're paying a lot of attention to the transformation programs of all the other business areas. We are going to be reading the agile strategy top to bottom. We're going to be reading the technology strategy top to bottom. We're going to read everyone's technical strategy from top to bottom. And we're going to identify what are the affordances for change that the environment is about to give to us. Right? And that is how we can potentially integrate and use this parasite strategy on making effective security change, is understanding how the host is changing and we go along with it. Right? We do not make things that are foreign to it, we go along with it. An example of adapting, for instance, an hyena strategy is recovering from incidents or situations that happen. Doesn't necessarily need to be security incidents. So something happens, we already have thought of some of the things that could potentially be improved in that space, and we going to capitalize on that moment to make about the necessary changes that we want from a security point of view. Right? So that's another way of going about it. Another part is that can potentially be is looking at, for instance, the technology change in seeing the things that the CTO is already trying to do, how we can potentially change some of those or slightly change. So not exactly like parasite, but trying to add some more things to it in order to make our security change. And finally, we've got the thing that is most expensive in every term, in terms of actual budget, in terms of social capital, in terms of convincing people on how to take security seriously, which is taking an apex predator strategy. So this is where we set our own plans and where we are competing for resources, right? Let's remember that every area in the organization is competing for the same bucket of money, right? There's a bucket of money that we're going to have for change in the organization every year, and we're all going to be competing for it, right? And more than likely, we will not be the apex predators in that environment. Right? You are likely to find, the CISO is likely to find that with his peers across the board, there will be some that get more budget, they get more of their way than all of the other ones. This is the nature of social systems, right? There is going to be people that are going to be dictating the show that is even not likely the CEO, right? It's going to be the person that can get more from the CEO, right? And so if we're not the apex predators, trying to understand, again, the hyena type strategy, thinking about what the apex predator is about to do and how we can put our plans up to them is probably our best chance. And I like to think of this from an energy gradient perspective. So ideally, I'm going to have parasite type strategies. If I can't do that, can I do an hyena type strategy on a problem? And if not, and that's the last thing because it's the most expensive in terms of energy, I go for asking for direct budget to make my security transformation. Does that make sense? Phil, would you like to add anything to that?
I think we've all sat in a room with apex predators.
Yes.
And as a CISO in a large organization, sometimes you have to be an apex predator just to get what you need.
Yep.
I would say when you are surrounded by apex predators, the danger of the parasite and the hyena is that you don't have control over that future. Yep. You are riding it, and there are times when you have to do that. When I've been a contractor to an organization or a consultant and I don't have ownership, I don't have control, I am somewhere between a parasite and a hyena for many of these sort of activities. Being an apex predator for the sake of it is dangerous because they fight. Yep. They fight and some of them lose. And I've lost that battle before and I've found myself in new employment. But that said, we shouldn't assume that a CISO is an apex predator. I think that's one of the big things that we a lot of the time a CISO isn't. In fact, they're so far down that they're a parasite, even if they look like an apex predator to their team. It makes perfect sense to me, the different strategies, and being clear about what strategy you're following is also incredibly useful. So understanding that you're a parasite sounds like a terrible pejorative word, but understanding that that's what you're doing, you can be more effective at it. Being a parasite and acting like an apex predator, short way out the door.
Yep, definitely agree. So this is a typology, right? So it's not something that we should not be trying to put ourselves or our plans in a boxes. These are just a way when I'm thinking about my security plan. So let's say I'm thinking that what we really need right now is an IAM strategy, right? Or IAM transformation, for instance. So in this typology can help us think, can I do this as a parasite? Following a parasite type strategy, can I only do this with an hyena, or do I really need to be pushing like an apex predator to make this happen, right? So it's a way of thinking about what approaches do I have available to try and make what I need to the changes that I want to see in the environment have a better success or require less energy to make happen. Cool. So, and then this is kind of the end. So Cynefin framework, I think, helps us make sense of the problems that we deal with so we can treat them according to their nature. Right? So this is kind of the final message that I'd like to get everyone with. So I hope that this was good, informative, and that you can all take something out of it. I certainly had a lot of fun giving this talk.
Mario, I'm going to say brilliant. You are much better at this than I am, and that was brilliantly delivered. Thank you.
So do we have any questions? Thank you, Barbara. I hope I addressed your question on the OA, on getting out of OA.
So we will be on the the OS, the Open Security Summit Slack. If anyone's got questions that they don't want to ask necessarily in the room, if you want to go away and think about it and come back with questions once you've grokked what we're talking about, Slack is a great place to find us. Otherwise, we're both on Twitter and we spend a lot of time arguing or discussing on Twitter, don't we?
So I actually, Andre, I completely agree with that. So the actually, when Dave Snowden introduces some of these analogies on the parasite and the symbiose, he usually talks about becoming first a parasite, so you can eventually become a symbiosis, right? But that may be not. So this is something that I've picked up from a lot of blog posts, and I've recently taken the Advanced Cynefin course, where I learned a lot better a lot of these things. But unfortunately, it's not something that Dave Snowden has written as a thing per se. It's kind of scattered around the blog. So this was also me picking up a lot of things from the Cognitive Edge blog. You're welcome.
All right. Any questions, everyone?
Yeah. Any more questions?
Cool. So that's it. Do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, I see that.
Okay, thank you everyone for this session, and also thank you Mario and Phil. It was really a great one. We learned lots from this, and hoping to see you in the next 2 hours and the other sessions. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Thank you.
And before we're going to end, we are